Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 7th of September 2020 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now the first article appears in the form of an editorial on page number 6 and is titled as Mixed Messaging. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Indian Economy. Recently, Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. In his speech, Prime Minister Modi pitched for greater amount of investment into India from the US-based companies so that the Indian economy gets integrated into the global supply chains. Now, the call for the integration of the Indian economy into global value chains has been appearing in the newspaper repeatedly, and hence this becomes extremely important from the perspective of the UPSC examination. For example, Budget 2021 had highlighted the need for Assemble in India on the lines of Make in India. Similarly, in Volume 1 of the Economic Survey 2019-20, we have the Chapter 5, which is exclusively dedicated for integration of Indian economy into the global value chains. Similarly, you must be aware that recently Japan has pitched for the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative as a trilateral approach involving India, Australia and Japan. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we shall be covering multiple dimensions related to the global value chains. Now, based upon our discussion, a main question for your practice here could be, India's integration into global value chains has the potential to bring about the much needed structural transformation of the Indian economy. Discuss. So, what exactly are the global value chains? See, for the manufacture of goods and services, multiple activities are involved. So as part of the global value chains, these multiple activities as such are not carried out in a single country. Rather, these multiple activities are carried out across multiple countries depending upon their strengths. Now, for example, if you look at the developed economies such as US, Japan, Germany, etc., their strength lies in research and development as well as the design of the new products. So the developed economies would focus upon these activities, whereas the developing economies where the labor cost is quite lower, these developing economies such as China would focus upon the production of goods and services. Now the global value chains have been developed for a number of products such as the automobiles, pharmaceuticals, textiles, electronics, chemicals, gold and jewelry, etc. However, the Apple iPhone is a good example to understand how the global value chains work. The US prepares the iPhone design and the prototypes, whereas the developed economies such as South Korea as well as Germany provide for the critical inputs such as the integrated circuits and the processors, while the final assembly of iPhones takes place in China, and from where the iPhones as such are marketed across the world. Now, if you look at the amount of value addition that is being done in China, it is hardly around 5%. In spite of this, China has immensely benefited from its integration with the global value chains, leading to the increase in the foreign direct investment, exports, employment, and consequently a higher GDP growth rate. Now, the global value chains have registered phenomenal growth post 1990s on account of various reasons such as the decline in the air and sea freight cost accompanied by the expansion in the ICT technologies that has made it possible for the increase in the trade of goods and services, the free flow of foreign capital as well as technology that has been made possible due to the establishment of the international organizations such as the World Trade Organization, emergence of European Union and China as the major links in the global value chains, The growing significance of the global value chains can be realized from the fact that the overall share of the GVC trade in the total world trade stands at almost around 50%. So almost around 50% of goods and services which are traded across the world is primarily on account of the global value chains. Now, to understand the country's integration into global value chains, we need to look at the share of the value added goods and services in the overall exports of a particular country. Now, from the perspective of India, these value added goods and services could be of two types. That is, the foreign value added goods and services and the domestic value added goods and services. Now, when we say the foreign value added goods and services, this essentially means that India has imported the intermediate goods from other countries, has done certain amount of value addition to those intermediate goods, and then these goods as such have been exported to other countries. Now, for example, the Indian pharmaceutical industry imports the active pharmaceutical ingredients as the intermediate goods from China, does certain amount of value addition, and the pharmaceutical drugs as such are then exported to the other countries. Now, as far as the domestic value added goods and services is concerned, under this, India either supplies the intermediate goods or the final goods to other countries without relying on the foreign imports. So the basic difference here is, under the foreign value added, India is importing goods from other countries, doing the value addition and then exporting. However, in case of the domestic value addition, India is not importing any foreign goods. Rather, here India is doing value addition to its own domestic goods and then exporting it to other countries. So when we look at the domestic value added goods, such kind of linkages are referred to as the forward linkages, whereas in case of the foreign value added goods, such linkages are referred to as the backward linkages. So if you want to know the extent of integration of a particular economy into the global value chains, then we simply have to look at the share of the domestic value added and the foreign value added goods and services in the share of the overall exports from a particular country. So higher the share, higher would be the integration of a particular economy with the global value chains. Now, coming to the most important question as to why should India get integrated into the global value chains. Now, for any economy, there are majorly four drivers, that is the private final consumption expenditure, that is the domestic demand, the government final consumption expenditure, investment, and the net exports, which is calculated as the total imports minus the total exports. Now, as far as India is concerned, it is the domestic demand, that is the private final consumption expenditure, that is considered to the major driver, accounting for almost 60% of India's GDP. However, if you look at the net exports, its share is minus 3%. Now, one main problem with respect to the higher share of the domestic demand here is that India in future, if it has to grow into a $5 trillion economy, then India cannot continue to rely only on the domestic demand. Rather, India has to cater even to the global demand as well. That is, in order to cater to the global demand, India would be required to boost its overall exports. Apart from that, the Economic Survey 2018-19 had called upon Indian economy to shift gears from the consumption-driven economy to the investment-driven economy. This it had argued on the lines of the economic model followed by the East Asian economies such as Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and so on. So the economic survey had highlighted that shifting gears from the consumption-driven economy to the investment-driven economy would enable India to realize its vision of the $5 trillion economy. Now, apart from boosting investment rates, India should also focus upon boosting of its exports on the lines of the model followed by the Chinese economy. Now, by boosting exports from the Indian economy, we would be able to sustain a virtuous economic cycle wherein the increase in the exports would increase the competition and innovation of the domestic companies, leading to enhanced job creation, attraction of more foreign investment, which consequently would give a push to the higher GDP growth rate. So, in a nutshell, there is a need for India to shift from a consumption driven model to investment and export driven model in order to achieve the higher GDP growth rate. So, coming to the benefits of the India's integration with the global value chains, first and foremost, it would promote economic growth and development. For example, if India is able to join the global supply chains, then there is no need for India to build the entire supply chain right from scratch. Joining the existing supply chain established by the advanced economies would be sufficient enough to promote industrialization and ensure the success of Make in India. Secondly, it will help us provide better access to a greater variety of high quality or less costly intermediate inputs. Integration with the global value chains will do away with the requirement of the firms to focus upon the entire supply chain. Instead, the firms as such would be required to focus upon certain specialized tasks, and this in turn promotes hyper specialization. Further, as seen in case of China, this also leads to transfer of capital as well as foreign technology from the foreign companies. Nextly, see, one of the main concern of the domestic companies is that they are unable to compete with the deep pocketed foreign companies. Now, this concern of the domestic firms can be addressed to the global value chains. This is so because India's integration into the global value chains promotes collaboration between the foreign and the domestic firms, wherein the foreign and the domestic firm would focus upon the specialized task in the production cycle. Now, for example, a foreign firm may focus upon the research and development, whereas a domestic firm may focus upon the production. So, in a way, the nature of tasks which are carried out by these two firms are not overlapping, and thus this promotes greater collaboration rather than competition between the foreign and the domestic firms. Nextly, the Economic Survey 2019-20 has highlighted that integration into global value chains will enable India to create 4 crore jobs by end of 2025, and this can further increase to 8 crore jobs by end of 2030. And lastly, as highlighted before, through such integration, India would be able to shift gears from consumption driven economy to investment and export driven economy. Thus, integration into global value chains can bring about the much needed structural transformation of the Indian economy from agriculture to manufacturing, from low end manufacturing to high end manufacturing, from the higher share of the informal workers to the higher share of the salaried workers, from lower productivity to higher productivity, from import dependency to the export led model, and consequently realization of a self-reliant or Atmanirbhar Bharat. Nextly, even though India is one of the largest producer of the agricultural commodities, its share in the global exports stands at merely 2.2%, and India is placed at 9th position. Now, this clearly highlights poor integration of India into the global agricultural supply chains. Hence, greater integration would translate into expanded market access and higher prices for the farmers, leading to doubling of their income levels. And lastly, according to OECD, integration of economies into global value chains lead to resilience, stability and flexibility in their production network, and hence such economies are more capable of responding to the domestic shocks. Now, in spite of these advantages, India has so far failed to get itself integrated into the global value chains. Now, this can be understood by looking at the GVC participation index that is published by OECD. This index for India is comparatively lower as compared to the smaller economies such as Vietnam as well as Malaysia. Now, there are a number of reasons for India's poor integration. For example, Prior to the year 1991, India followed the state-led development with inward-oriented policies such as the import substitution, discouraging foreign direct investment, license Raj system, and so on. Nextly, most of the domestic firms have focused upon the domestic market and not on exporting goods to the other countries. Nextly, now lead firms are basically the firms that establish the supply chains across the world, and hence they are considered to be the major drivers of the global value chains. Now, for example, in case of India, in case of the automobile industry, the Tata Motors is considered to be the lead firm. Similarly, in case of the pharmaceutical industry, Ranbaxy is considered to be the lead firm, wherein both Tata Motors as well as Ranbaxy have acted as lead firms and have established the global value chains across the world. Now, in case of India, it has happened only in case of the pharmaceutical industry and to a certain extent in the automobile industry because of the presence of these two lead firms. Whereas in other sectors, such lead firms are nearly absent, and hence India has not been able to establish the global value chain. Some of the other reasons for the poor integration include the lack of ease of doing business, particularly with respect to land acquisition and labor laws, lack of availability of the skilled manpower, particularly in the crucial sectors such as the electronics, the higher share of the small firms or MSMEs in the manufacturing sector, the higher logistic cost, which accounts for almost 14% of India's GDP as compared to 9% in US or 11% in Japan. So we must realize that the global value chains are a much needed tool for bringing about a structural transformation of the Indian economy. Hence, keeping in mind various benefits associated with the global value chains, the Indian government should address the various constraints which are highlighted here in order to successfully integrate the Indian economy into the global value chains. Now, the next article appears on page number 6 in the form of a lead article and is titled as Courts Drift and Chinks in the Judiciary's Armour. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Polity and Governance. Now, this particular lead article is written by Mr. A.P. Shah, who is the former Chief Justice of Delhi and Madras High Court. Now, this particular article is highly critical of a Supreme Court judge who has recently retired. Now, keeping aside this criticism of a Supreme Court judge, we will look at the broader aspects about the independence of the Indian judiciary and the political interference in the working of the Supreme Court. Now, as per the Indian Constitution, the Supreme Court is required to act as the guarantor of fundamental rights. The Supreme Court, as the highest court, is required to keep a check on the powers of the executive and ensure the basic rights to the Indian citizens. However, a number of legal scholars and legal luminaries have highlighted that in recent times there has been marked shift in the stance of the Supreme Court from a rights-based court to the executive court. Now, what exactly do you mean by the executive court in this particular context? Now, executive court is a court that fails to keep a check on the executive powers. It means a court, instead of being neutral and impartial in its judgments, delivers verdicts in the favor of the government. This in turn leads to a political interference in the working of the judiciary. It shatters the image of the judiciary in the eyes of the people, and this also leads to the loss of trust and the confidence of the people in the working of the Indian judiciary. Now, in this particular article, Justice A.P. Shah has highlighted a number of instances of how the Supreme Court has functioned as an executive court. For example, Justice A.P. Shah has highlighted that a large number of judges have accepted post-retirement jobs from the government. So, it is quite natural that when such judges were working in the Supreme Court, then those judges as such would have delivered verdict in the favor of the government. Justice A.P. Shah has also highlighted about the instances of the judges who are pro-government and they stand ready to deliver verdict in the favor of the government. This emergence of executive court has also been attributed to the deeply flawed and opaque master of the roster system. Now, this particular issue of the master of roster system is quite important since in the year 2018, four Supreme Court judges had held a press conference in order to register the differences with the then Chief Justice of India. Now, this press conference was considered to be quite unprecedented since normally the internal conflicts within the Indian judiciary do not come out openly. Now, in this particular press conference, the four Supreme Court judges had highlighted that the Chief Justice of India was misusing his powers as a master of roster by selectively allocating the politically sensitive cases to certain selected benches in order to get a favorable verdict. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we'll understand as to what exactly is the master of roster system, what was a recent controversy, and what should be done in order to address the flaws in the present master of roster system. Now, coming to the various aspects about the master of roster system. Now, Article 145 of the Indian Constitution states that the Supreme Court, with the approval of the President, can make rules in order to regulate the practice and the procedure of the court. Accordingly, the Supreme Court can lay down various rules in order to allocate various cases to its benches. Accordingly, we have the concept of the master of roster system. The master of roster system basically means that it is a privilege of the Chief Justice of India to constitute the Supreme Court benches in order to hear the cases. So, in a way, through the master of roster system, the different cases before the Supreme Court are allocated to the various benches. Now, this particular roster is actually prepared by the Registrar of the Supreme Court under the orders of the Chief Justice of India. Now, in this particular roster, we can come across general or specific instructions regarding assignment of a particular case to a bench. Apart from that, if on a particular bench to which the case has been allocated and if on such bench the judges are not available, then such a case can be transferred to the another bench. Now, you must be wondering as to on what basis are the different cases allocated to the different benches in the Supreme Court. Now, even though the allocation of cases to different benches of the Supreme Court is considered to be one of the most important aspects related to the functioning of the Supreme Court, in reality, the Supreme Court has not laid down any kind of written procedure to be followed. So normally what happens is when a case comes up before the Supreme Court, such a case is in turn allocated to a particular bench depending upon the subject matter. For example, let's say the subject matter of a particular case is related to taxation, then the case as such may be referred to a particular bench of the Supreme Court that specializes in the cases related to taxation. Similarly, let's say there is a particular case dealing with the public interest litigation, then such a case may be referred to a particular bench of the Supreme Court which specializes in hearing the cases related to the PILs. But this allocation of the cases to different benches of the Supreme Court is more of a convention rather than being rules based. So once the registrar of the Supreme Court allocates a particular case to a bench of the Supreme Court, this is in turn approved by the Chief Justice of India. In some of the cases which are considered to be politically sensitive, the Supreme Court registry can mark such a case as politically sensitive. In such cases, the Chief Justice of India comes into picture and he himself allocates the sensitive cases to certain specific benches. So in a way, the Chief Justice of India enjoys discretionary powers with respect to allocation of politically sensitive cases to the specific benches. And this is where the problem has arisen. As highlighted before, recently in the year 2018, 4 Supreme Court judges had questioned this particular authority of the Chief Justice of India in allocating politically sensitive cases to certain selected benches in order to get a favorable verdict. So, in a way, it was highlighted that there are certain specific benches in the Supreme Court consisting of the Supreme Court judges, and these specific benches, as such, normally deliver verdict in the favor of the government. So, whenever certain politically sensitive cases arise, the Chief Justice of India had been allocating such politically sensitive cases to such specific benches in order to get a verdict in the favor of the government. So, this in a way undermines the independence of the judiciary. This promotes the formation of an executive court rather than a rights-based court, and more importantly, this leads to erosion of trust as well as confidence of the people in the functioning of the Indian judiciary. So the main issue which is raised with respect to Master of Roster system is that there is no written procedure to allocate the cases, and the Chief Justice of India in turn enjoys huge discretionary powers which in a way may be misused. So the question which arises here is, how do we address the present flaws in the Master of Roster system? Now, first and foremost, the Master of Roster system has been questioned on the grounds that there could be a personal bias of the Chief Justice of India in handing over a case to a particular or a specific bench. So what we have to do here is we need to do away with this personal bias, and this can be done by allocating cases to the different benches of the Supreme Court randomly through the computer. Now, this random allocation of cases to the different benches of the Supreme Court should also keep in mind the expertise of the judges on the different subject matters. Nextly, politically sensitive cases should ideally be handled by a larger bench of Supreme Court, which may comprise of at least 5 Supreme Court judges. Nextly, as highlighted before, the acceptance of jobs by the Supreme Court judges upon their retirement has in turn raised concerns about the political interference in the working of the Indian judiciary. Ideally, in order to handle this particular problem, there should be cooling off period for the judges, wherein the judges should not be allowed to accept any kind of government post for at least 2 to 3 years upon their retirement. Apart from that, whenever the judges are hearing cases where the judges feel that there is a conflict of interest, if they continue to hear such a case, then the judges should recuse themselves from hearing of such cases. So when judges recuse themselves from hearing of cases when there is a conflict of interest, this in turn leads to greater amount of public trust and confidence in the functioning of the Indian judiciary. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to Master of Roster system. Now the next article appears on page number 4. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of a recent research paper which was published. Now according to this particular research paper, there is a need to have a relook at India's forest policy. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we'll understand as to why there is a need to have a relook at India's forest policy and what kind of changes has this research paper suggested. Now, according to State of Forest Report 2019, the total forest cover in case of India is 21.67% and the tree cover is around 2.89%. So if you add up the total tree and the forest cover, then this is almost around 24.56%. Now this particular area under the forest and tree cover is much below our target of having at least 33% of the geographical area of India under the forest. Now the forests in case of India are protected through various legislations and policies such as the Forest Act 1927, the Forest Conservation Act 1980, the National Forest Policy 1988 and so on. Now until the 20th century, the forests across the globe including India were specifically managed for the timber production in order to meet the industrial demand. However, in recent times there has been shift in the management of the forest from the timber production to the sustainable management on account of multiple reasons. For example, according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, the higher focus of management of forests on the timber production has led to diversion of a large amount of forested area towards the plantations. Similarly, in the recent years, because of the growing concerns on account of climate change, there has been greater amount of emphasis on the biodiversity conservation. Accordingly, a large number of area, particularly in case of India, has been declared as national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and so on. So this particular shift in the management of forests from the timber production to their sustainable management has in turn led to a number of restrictions on felling of trees in the government owned forests. So while earlier there was no restriction on felling of trees because the overall idea was to maximize the timber production, but now the focus has shifted to the sustainable management, and accordingly a number of restrictions have been laid down in order to prevent uncontrolled felling of the trees in the forest. Now this in turn has actually impacted the timber production. See, what has happened is in the recent years, on account of growing population, rapid urbanization as well as industrialization, the demand for timber, particularly in India, has increased. On the other hand, the restrictions on felling of trees in the government owned forests has led to the reduced supply of timber. So this particular demand supply mismatch with respect to timber has in turn led to almost around sevenfold increase in the timber imports into the Indian economy over the last 20 years. Accordingly, the research paper which was published recently highlights that we need to have a relook at India's forest policy in order to address this particular demand supply mismatch with respect to the timber. At the same time, this particular research paper has highlighted that the conservation policy of the government must focus upon maintaining ecological balance and improving the biodiversity through the protected area management. Now, with respect to addressing the demand supply mismatch with respect to timber, this particular research paper has given predominantly two important suggestions. First and foremost, the research paper has highlighted that we can increase the timber production from the trees outside the forest area. Now, this essentially means that we have to grow the trees outside the government recorded forest areas. Now, this is particularly important because the potential of timber production from the government recorded forest area as per the research paper is almost around 3.17 million cubic meters. On the other hand, the potential of harnessing the timber from the trees outside the forest area is actually as high as around 42 million cubic meters. At the same time, growing of trees outside the forest area will enable the carbon sequestration and help us in mitigating the effects of climate change. Further, growing of trees outside the recorded forest areas would also give a boost to the rural incomes. The second suggestion given in the research paper is that according to a research paper, the states must devise a working plans and demarcate 10% of the forest for the plantations. Overall, if you look at the gist of this particular research paper, the research paper simply highlights that higher focus of the government on the sustainable management of the forest and restrictions on felling of trees has led to the demand supply mismatch in the timber. Accordingly, in order to address this particular problem, we need to harness the timber production from the trees outside the forest area, and a certain amount of government recorded forest area can also be demarcated for the plantations. Further, as far as prelims examination is concerned, from this particular article, one would be required to understand about the various highlights of the State of Forest Report 2019, such as what exactly is the definition of forest cover as provided under the State of Forest Report, and how this particular definition of forest cover is different from the protected forest or, for that matter, the reserved forest. Then you should know about the trends in the total forest cover in India, the types of forest cover, that is very dense forest cover, moderately dense cover, open forest, and on what basis these forest covers are categorized, the states that have the highest forest cover in terms of absolute area as well as in terms of the percentage, then certain aspects related to the mangrove cover. Now, this particular aspect about the state of forest report becomes quite important because in the earlier prelims examinations, questions have been asked with respect to the states that have largest forest cover as well as the states and the union territories having the mangrove cover. Now, all of these aspects related to the state of forest report 2019 have been covered by us in the part 4 of our economic survey video 2019-20, which is available in the YouTube. So I would suggest you to go through this particular video in order to have an understanding about the state of forest report 2019, which is quite important for your upcoming prelims examination. Now the next article appears on page number 10. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of an analysis that has been published by the Climate Research Horizon. According to this particular analysis, shutting down of the thermal power plants which are considered to be more than 20 years old can lead to a saving of almost around 53,000 crore. Now these financial savings is on account of not having to spend on retrofitting these plants to reduce the toxicity of their emissions, as well as because of switching to more cleaner and greener renewable energy projects. Apart from that, this particular article also highlights that a number of states in case of India have installed capacity which is much higher than their actual requirements. Now, as far as this particular article is concerned, from the perspective of the UPSC examination, one would be required to understand various aspects related to the energy sector, such as the contribution of different sources of energy, the ranking of the states in terms of the renewable energy, and so on. See, as on April 1st, 2020, the total installed capacity in case of India was 3.7 lakh megawatt. And out of the different sources of energy, the thermal energy accounted for 62% of the installed capacity. And this was followed by the renewable energy which accounted for 24%. So the total installed capacity of the renewable energy is around 87,000 megawatt. Now when we say the renewable energy here, it corresponds to the wind power, solar power, biopower, small hydropower and waste to energy projects. The small hydropower projects are basically those power projects whose installed capacity is below 25 megawatt. So if a hydropower has an installed capacity of greater than 25 megawatt, then such a hydropower is considered as a large hydropower project. So if you look at the contribution of the various renewable energy sources, please do note that the share of the wind power is much higher than the share of the solar power, and this is followed by biopower. Now prior to the year 2019, the large hydropower projects were not considered as the renewable energy projects. However, in the year 2019, the Union Cabinet has come up with new hydropower policy. As part of this particular policy, even the large hydropower projects are presently considered as the renewable energy projects. So as per the latest hydropower policy, if you calculate the total share of the renewable energy in the total installed capacity of India, it will be 24% plus 12%, and thus presently the share of renewable energy is around 36%. If you look at the top states in terms of solar energy and wind energy, in case of solar energy, the top producing states are Karnataka, followed by Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu. As far as the wind power is concerned, the top state is Tamil Nadu, followed by Gujarat and Maharashtra. Further, as far as the progress report of the renewable energy is concerned, as you all must be aware, the government of India has come up with a vision to generate 175 gigawatt of renewable energy by the end of 2022, out of which the target for the solar energy is 100 gigawatt, wind is 60 gigawatt, biomass is 10 gigawatt, and small hydropower is 5 gigawatt. And India has also set a target of having 40% of the installed power capacity from the non-fossil fuels by the end of 2030. So if you look at the achievements of India as on December 2019, so far we have been able to generate 86 gigawatt of renewable energy as against a target of 175 gigawatt, out of which the solar energy accounts for 33, wind energy accounts for 37, biomass 9.8, and the small hydropower 4.6. So presently, if you look at the share of the renewable energy, it is 24 from all the renewable energy sources, excluding the large hydropower projects. And if we include the large hydropower projects, then the total share of the renewable energy would be 36%. And the target, as highlighted before, is 40%. The next article appears on page number 1. Now, presently under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, any entity based in India, if it has to obtain the foreign funding, then such an entity is required to have the prior license from the Ministry of Home Affairs. Now, this particular article highlights that the Ministry of Home Affairs has cancelled the FCRA license for 6 NGOs, out of which 4 are the Christian-based associations. Now, even though the government has not specified the reason for the suspension, but it is believed that these 4 Christian groups were involved in the religious conversions. Apart from that, recently the central government had introduced the FCRA rules, which empower the central government to declare any organization to be of political nature. Once declared as an organization of political nature, the central government can prohibit such organizations from accepting the foreign funding. In response, the Supreme Court of India felt that these rules introduced by the central government can actually be misused in order to target those organizations that criticize the government policies. So what the government can basically do here is, if any organization is criticizing its policies, the government can simply declare such an organization to be of political nature, and once that organization is declared as a political nature, it will no longer be able to accept the foreign funding. So the Supreme Court of India had declared that the government cannot declare an organization as political in order to prevent the funding under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act for the legitimate forms of dissent in a democratic country such as India. So since this particular topic related to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act has been appearing in the newspaper repeatedly, one can expect questions related to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act in your upcoming prelims examination. So in order to regulate the acceptance and utilization of the foreign contribution, earlier we had the Foreign Contribution and Regulation Act 1976, and this was replaced by a more comprehensive and wider Foreign Contribution Regulation Act 2010. So this particular act basically states as to who can receive the foreign funding, who cannot receive foreign funding, under what circumstances one can receive the foreign funding, and who all can provide for the foreign funding. As far as the entities who are prohibited to receive the foreign funding under this particular act include the candidates who are contesting for elections, correspondents, columnists, cartoonist, editor of a registered newspaper, the people who are associated with the government such as the judge, government servant, employee of any corporation which is substantially controlled by the Indian government, the member of any legislature, the political party. Further, the central government can declare any organization to be of political nature, and once it is declared so, such an organization cannot receive the foreign funding. Then any association or a company that is involved in the production or the broadcast of the audio news or the audiovisual news, with respect to who can provide the funding under this particular act, government of any foreign country, any international agency but excluding United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, any foreign company, a trade union based in any other foreign country, a foreign trust, or a citizen of a foreign country. Apart from that, please do note that whenever an Indian company in which at least 50% of stakes were held by a foreign entity. If such an Indian company provided for funding, then such funding was actually under the ambit of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act 2010. But as highlighted before, the political parties in case of India are actually prohibited from receiving the foreign funding. So in case of India, what had happened was some of the national level political parties such as BJP, Indian National Congress, etc. had accepted the foreign fundings from the Indian companies, in which more than 50% of the stakes were actually held by the foreign entity. Now this was in clear violation of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act 2010, since the political parties are barred from accepting the foreign contributions. Accordingly, the Finance Act 2016 introduced a retrospective amendment. Now, through such retrospective amendment, the contribution to the political parties from an Indian company in which 50% of the stakes are held by a foreign entity, they would not be considered as a foreign funding under the FCRA, and accordingly such political parties would not be subjected to the FCRA scrutiny. Now these are some of the important aspects with respect to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act 2010. Now the next article appears on the editorial page number 6 and is titled as Policy Lessons in Tamil Nadu's Language Formula. Choosing a language as an official language or a language for a medium of instruction in a school is always challenging in a multilinguistic and multicultural society such as India. Now, in our DNS dated 5th of August 2020, we had highlighted that the newly adopted National Education Policy has decided to continue with the three-language formula with certain amount of flexibilities. The idea behind the continuation of the three-language formula is to promote multilingualism and to promote national unity, wherein Hindi as such can emerge as an official link language between the northern and the southern states. Now, in this particular DNS, we had also highlighted that in spite of the flexibilities provided under the National Education Policy with respect to the three-language formula, this three-language formula has been opposed by some of the states such as the state of Tamil Nadu. Now, Tamil Nadu believes that the adoption of the three-language formula would lead to the imposition of the Hindi language on the southern states. Apart from that, it also believes that the three-language formula would be an unnecessary burden on the students. Accordingly, the government of Tamil Nadu has been focusing on a two-language formula comprising of Tamil and English. In this particular regard, this particular article, which is quite specific to the government of Tamil Nadu, highlights various advantages that have accrued to the people of Tamil Nadu on account of the adoption of the two-language formula, wherein the article highlights that English has acted as a link language between the northern and the southern states. Apart from that, the adoption of the two-language formula has actually led the people in Tamil Nadu to voluntarily adopt Hindi. So rather than imposing language on any section or on any particular region of a country, we must give necessary freedom to the people to choose whatever language they would want to learn. So in a way, this particular article here is a critique of the three-language formula that has been provided under the National Education Policy. Now, in our DNS dated 5th of August 2020, we have already discussed various problems with respect to the three-language formula. Hence, we would not be covering this particular article once again. The link to this particular DNS video has been provided in the description box below for your reference. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now, let us have a look at the question for the day.